The morning of April 15th, 1928, 5 miles off the coast of Oahu, the USS Langley turned her bow into the wind and increased speed to 18 knots. On her flight deck, 35 aircraft sat packed so tightly that mechanics could barely squeeze between wingtips. Boeing F-two-B-one fighters, their radial engines cold, their propellers still. Every regulation, every British doctrine, every Japanese manual said this was insane. You couldn't park 3 dozen aircraft on a deck barely 500 feet long. You couldn't launch them all, and you certainly couldn't do it in less than an hour. Captain Joseph Mason Reeves, standing on the bridge with his arms crossed, disagreed. He'd spent the last 6 months proving that every assumption about carrier aviation was wrong. This morning, he'd prove it again. At 0630 hours, he gave the order. Flight quarters. What happened next would be studied in war colleges for the next century. 35 aircraft, launching in 7 minutes. 1 plane every 12 seconds. A tempo of operations that shouldn't have been possible with 1920s technology and converted collier that the Navy called an aircraft carrier, but everyone else called the covered wagon. But the miracle wasn't the speed. The miracle was that it worked at all, because 6 months earlier, the Langley could barely launch 8 planes without creating chaos that looked like disaster waiting to happen. The transformation wasn't about new technology or more powerful engines. It was about one captain who'd never flown an airplane looking at the flight deck and seeing something nobody else had noticed. He saw people getting in each other's way because nobody knew what anyone else was doing. He saw bottlenecks where aircraft waited for elevators while deck space sat empty. He saw procedures designed by committees that had never actually tried to land on a moving ship. And he saw an opportunity to rebuild carrier aviation from the ground up using a simple principle that nobody in the world's navies had considered. What if the flight deck wasn't a staging area? What if it was the hangar? This is the story of how one captain's ridiculous ideas about deck operations transformed the Langley from an experiment into a fighting force. How coloured shirts became the language of the flight deck, how synchronized chaos became a doctrine, and how a man they called Bull proved that carrier aviation's greatest weapon wasn't the airplane, it was the 30 seconds between launches. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. October 19th, 1925, San Diego. Captain Joseph Reeves boarded the USS Langley with orders that confused almost everyone who knew him. He was a battleship man. 48 years old, a football legend from his Naval Academy days who'd earned the nickname Bull by playing without a helmet until a doctor warned him one more hit would kill him, so he strapped a leather harness to his head and invented football's first protective headgear. He'd served on the battleship Oregon during the Spanish-American War. He'd commanded the collier Jupiter before her conversion. He'd been head of the tactics department at the Naval War College, where he'd become known for innovative thinking that made other officers uncomfortable. But he'd never flown an airplane. He'd taken the Naval Aviation Observer course at Pensacola the month before, the absolute minimum qualification required by law for anyone commanding an aviation unit. 30 days of riding in the back seat while someone else flew, and now he was commanding the Navy's only aircraft carrier and all naval aviation in the Pacific Fleet. The assignment was political calculation by Admiral Edward Eberle, the Chief of Naval Operations. The Navy's air community was divided. The Bureau of Aeronautics wanted aviators running everything. The Bureau of Navigation thought aviation was a specialty that needed fleet integration. Real aviators like Commander John Towers, who'd been flying since 1911, couldn't get the job because they weren't senior enough. Reeves was the compromise. Senior enough to command, respected enough to avoid political fights, innovative enough that maybe, just maybe, he'd figure out what carrier aviation was actually supposed to do. When Reeves came aboard the Langley, what he found was an experiment that had stalled. The ship was 4 years old, converted from the collier Jupiter in 1922. She was slow, 14 knots maximum. Her flight deck was wooden planks laid over a steel framework built on top of her original coal-handling deck. She had one elevator that craned aircraft up from the main deck below, a process that took 12 minutes per aircraft. The ship's company called her the covered wagon because she looked like a barge. Someone had put a barn roof on. She carried 1 squadron, 12 aircraft, VF-2, flying Vought VE-7S biplanes, light aircraft, fabric and wood, barely capable of military operations. They took off one at a time. They landed one at a time. Recovery operations took hours because each aircraft had to be lowered by elevator to the main deck before the next one could land. The entire carrier could generate maybe 8 sorties on a good day, less if weather interfered. Reeves spent his first month doing nothing but watching. He observed flight operations from every angle: bridge, flight deck, main deck. He took notes in a leather journal. He asked questions that annoyed people because they revealed how much the Navy didn't actually know about carrier operations. Simple questions. Profound questions. Questions like, what's the most efficient way of launching planes? What's the maximum interval between planes in a scouting screen? How many aircraft can actually operate from this deck? Why are we storing everything below? In November 1925, Reeves called a meeting at Naval Air Station, North Island. Every officer from the Langley attended, every squadron commander. Reeves stood in front of them with his journal and delivered an assessment that was equal parts blunt and insulting. "Gentlemen," he said, "you have no conception of either the capabilities or limitations of the Air Force." The room went silent. These were aviators, men who'd been flying for years, men who'd risked their lives testing procedures, men who'd trained on British carriers and studied Japanese doctrine. And this battleship captain who'd spent 1 month riding in the back seat was telling them they didn't understand aviation. Reeves continued, "I've been watching your operations. I've been studying your procedures, and I've been asking questions. Do you know what I've learned? Nobody knows the answers. Not you, not me, not the British, not the Japanese. We're all guessing." He held up his journal. "I've written down over 1,000 questions about carrier operations. 1,000 things we need to know if this ship is going to be useful to the fleet. And right now, we can't answer most of them." He looked around the room. "So here's what we're going to do. We're going to find the answers. This ship isn't going to be an aircraft carrier yet. It's going to be a school. We're going to test everything, question everything. And we're going to build carrier aviation from the ground up using what actually works, not what some manual says should work." One officer raised his hand. "Captain, the Langley is designed to carry 12 aircraft. That's what the elevator can support. That's what the main deck can store. How are we going to answer questions about mass launches when we can only handle 1 squadron?" Reeves smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who'd already done the math and didn't like what regulations were telling him. "Lieutenant, why? Are we storing aircraft on the main deck?" "Sir, that's where the hangar is. That's where maintenance happens. That's where nothing happens except wasted time." Reeves walked to a blackboard and drew the Langley's profile. "Look at this ship. We have 534 feet of flight deck. We're using it to launch 1 aircraft at a time, then clearing it so the next one can land. The rest of the time, it's empty. Meanwhile, we're cramming everything into a dark, cramped main deck and spending 12 minutes per aircraft moving them up and down." He turned to face them. "What if we stored them on the flight deck? All of them. Lined up, ready to launch. We could carry 2 full squadrons, 36 aircraft, maybe more. The flight deck becomes the hangar. The main deck becomes a maintenance shop for major work only." The silence in the room was different now. Not shock, calculation. Every officer was mentally reviewing why this couldn't work and coming up empty. Commander Eugene Wilson, Reeves's chief of staff, spoke carefully. "Captain, the Langley's officers have concluded that 12 aircraft is the maximum that can safely operate from this ship. Safety is the key factor. 3 times that number creates hazards to pilots we can't mitigate." Reeves nodded. "I've read their analysis. It assumes we operate the way we're operating now. Random movement. No system. People getting in each other's way. But what if we designed a system? What if every person on that flight deck had a specific job and stayed in their lane? What if we could look at the deck and instantly know who was doing what? He let that sink in. The British store everything below because they operate in the North Atlantic where weather damages aircraft on deck. Fine. That's their problem. The Japanese are copying the British. Also fine. But we operate in the Pacific. Mild weather, calm seas most of the year. Why are we copying their procedures when we don't have their constraints? Another officer tried. Sir, coordinating that many people on a small deck is exactly what we're going to figure out. Reeves closed his journal. We start tomorrow. I want every assumption questioned, every procedure tested, and I want answers to those 1,000 questions. Because right now, the Langley is a curiosity. I'm going to make her a warship. What Reeves was proposing violated everything the world's navies understood about carrier operations in 1925. The British Royal Navy had pioneered carriers. They had HMS Argus since 1918. They had experience. They had doctrine. Their procedure was clear. Store aircraft on the hangar deck below, protected from weather. Use elevators to bring them up one or two at a time. Launch. Land. Return below. This kept aircraft safe and maintained an orderly flight deck. The Japanese had been building carriers since the early 20s. They'd studied British methods carefully. Their carriers followed the same philosophy. Small air groups, careful operations, emphasis on protecting aircraft from the elements. The Hosho carried 21 aircraft, but never tried to operate all of them simultaneously. American carriers before Reeves followed the same pattern. The Langley's designers had assumed the hangar deck was where aircraft lived. The flight deck was just a runway. You brought planes up, you launched them, you landed them, you took them back down. Simple, orderly, safe, slow. Reeves looked at this system and saw a bottleneck that made carrier aviation nearly useless in actual combat. He'd studied something called Lanchester's N-square law during his time at the Naval War College. It was a mathematical model of combat effectiveness. The key insight, the combat power of a military force, is proportional to the square of the number of units multiplied by their individual fighting value. In plain English, numbers matter more than anyone thought. A fleet that could launch 20 aircraft had 4 times the combat power of a fleet launching 10 aircraft, not twice the power. If you could concentrate force, you could dominate. But only if you could actually get those aircraft in the air quickly enough to mass them. The Langley's 12 aircraft, slow launch system meant she could never concentrate force. By the time the last plane launched, the first ones had already burned 20% of their fuel weighting. Range suffered. Combat persistence suffered. The carrier became a scout platform at best, nothing that could seriously threaten enemy capital ships. Reeves understood something the aviation community hadn't fully grasped yet. The carrier's value wasn't measured in aircraft quality. It was measured in sortie generation. How many aircraft could you put over the target? How quickly? And how often? That was the math that mattered. And right now, the Langley's math was terrible. Deck park was the solution. But deck park created a problem nobody had solved. How do you manage 36 aircraft and 50 crew members on a deck the size of a football field and a half, where everyone is moving constantly? Engines are roaring, propellers are spinning, and one mistake means someone dies or an aircraft goes overboard? The answer Reeves developed became the foundation of carrier operations for the next century. But in November 1925, it was just an idea that seemed impossible. The first test came in December. Reeves ordered VF-2 to bring all 12 of their aircraft to the flight deck and leave them there. No more lowering them below after operations. The main deck would handle only major maintenance. Everything else happened topside. The immediate problem: the Langley's deck could barely fit 12 aircraft if you parked them perfectly. Wingtips had to nestle between other wingtips. Tails had to clear propellers by inches. There was no room for error. No room for people to walk freely. Reeves had the crew practice moving aircraft at night, in the dark, using only hand signals and touch. If they could do it in pitch-black conditions, they could do it under combat stress. The second problem: Launching 12 aircraft still took too long because procedures were random. Some crew members worked on arresting gear. Others stood around waiting for their aircraft. The flight deck officer would wave his arms generally at whoever was nearby. Chaos that somehow worked, but barely. Reeves stood on the deck one morning watching this chaos and had the realization that changed everything. People were confused because they couldn't tell who was who in the crowd. Everyone wore the same blue dungarees. A mechanic looked like a pilot, looked like a plane handler, looked like a fueling specialist. You couldn't tell at a glance who should be doing what. So everyone hesitated. Everyone double-checked. Time wasted. Safety compromised. With the help of Commander John Towers, the Langley's executive officer, Reeves came up with something so simple it seemed obvious in retrospect. Color code the crew. Give each function its own colored shirt. Make it visual. Make it instant. Make it so anyone glancing at the deck knew exactly what was happening. They started with basics. Blue shirts for plane handlers. The muscle. The guys who pushed aircraft around. Who positioned them for launch. Who manhandled 2,000-pound fighters into tight spaces. Brown shirts for plane captains. The crew chiefs responsible for individual aircraft. They did the final checks before launch. They greeted pilots. They made sure their bird was ready. Purple shirts for fueling crews. Aviation gasoline was dangerous. Highly flammable. These men needed to be immediately identifiable, so everyone gave them space when they were working. Yellow shirts for directors. The officers and senior enlisted who controlled aircraft movement. They guided planes. They gave the signals. Everyone watched the yellow shirts for instruction. The system was tested in January 1926. First day with colored shirts, deck operations efficiency improved by 40%, just by making roles visible, no new training required, no new equipment, just different colored cotton, and suddenly everyone knew their job and everyone else's job by sight. Reeves pushed further. He broke the flight deck crew into specialized teams. Each team owned one task. The arresting gear team did nothing but operate the cables that caught landing aircraft. The hook release team freed the tailhooks. The positioning team moved aircraft forward after landing. The fueling team operated only the fuel lines. The maintenance team did quick checks. Specialization meant speed. It meant expertise. It meant when things went wrong, the right people were already in position to fix it. By February 1926, the Langley could launch 12 aircraft in under 10 minutes. Down from 30 minutes the previous November, Reeves kept pushing. He wanted more aircraft. He studied the deck measurements. 534 feet long, 64 feet wide. He did the math on aircraft dimensions. The Boeing F-two-B-one fighter was coming into service. Compact. Wingspan 30 feet. With careful parking, with wings almost touching, he could fit 36 aircraft on that deck with 6 more stored below for reserve. The Langley's officers protested. "Captain, you'll kill pilots. There's no clearance. One mistake and we'll have a chain reaction crash. A dozen aircraft destroyed. Careers ended." Reeves overruled them. "We're going to find out what's possible, not what's comfortable." In March 1926, he received authorization from the Battle Fleet commander to increase the Langley's aircraft complement. 2 full squadrons, VF-2 with fighters, plus a second squadron, 36 aircraft total. The officers thought it was suicide. The pilots weren't sure. The deck crew, wearing their new colored shirts, didn't care. They'd learned to trust the system. The first time they spotted 36 aircraft on the Langley's flight deck, it looked absurd. Aircraft everywhere. Wingtips overlapping, tails clearing propellers by 6 inches, men squeezed between planes. One wrong move and you had catastrophe. But Reeves had choreographed it. Every aircraft had a number. Every position on deck had a designated spot. The yellow shirts directed movement using standardized hand signals. The blue shirts pushed and pulled with synchronized effort. The brown shirts climbed into cockpits to control brakes during repositioning. It worked, barely. The first launch of 36 aircraft took 45 minutes, too slow, but they'd proved it could be done. Now came the optimization. Reeves had been studying the bottleneck. The problem wasn't engine start. It wasn't taxi. It was the sequence. They were launching aircraft randomly. Whoever was ready first went first. That meant aircraft in back had to wait while planes in front warmed up. Time wasted. Fuel burned. He redesigned the launch sequence. Aircraft in launch position, already forward, would start engines simultaneously. While they warmed up, the blue shirts would be positioning the next wave behind them. The instant the first aircraft left the deck, the next one moved forward. No gaps. Continuous flow. The yellow shirt directors practiced on a wooden mock-up on the dock. They rehearsed hand signals until they could communicate complex instructions without voice over the noise of 36 radial engines at full throttle. They developed a signal language. Thumb up. Throttle up. Flat hand pushing forward. Taxi ahead. Fist. Stop. Rotating finger. Turn engine. Two fingers pointing at eyes, then pointing forward. Watch forward. Crossed arms. Hold position. By March 1927, the system was refined enough to test in fleet exercises. The Langley participated in Fleet Problem 7. Her mission: simulate an attack on the Panama Canal. Launched 30 aircraft in 23 minutes. They achieved total surprise. The defenders never expected a carrier to generate that much striking power that quickly. The exercise umpires ruled it a successful attack. The Langley had just proved that carrier aviation could threaten strategic targets if you could concentrate aircraft fast enough. But Reeves wanted faster. 23 minutes was good. It wasn't good enough. He'd been analysing the launch process. Most time was wasted during engine warm-up. Pilots were cautious. They wanted their engines fully warm before takeoff. Understandable. Nobody wants to ditch in the ocean because their engine quit 30 seconds after launch. But Reeves calculated that they were being too cautious. The Boeing F-two-B-one's Wright R1790 engine needed 3 minutes of warm-up. The pilots were taking 5 to 7 minutes. That conservatism was costing them speed. He proposed something radical. Standardize warm-up time, 3 minutes exactly. No more. Use a stopwatch. The yellow shirt director would signal engine start. 3 minutes later, signal throttle up for takeoff, whether the pilot felt ready or not. The pilots hated it. They argued it was dangerous. Reeves countered with data from engine manufacturers and maintenance logs. 3 minutes was sufficient for these engines in Pacific climate conditions. Longer warm-up didn't improve reliability. It just burned fuel and wasted time. The pilots grudgingly agreed to test it. In April 1928, the Langley was operating near Hawaii for Fleet Problem 8. The exercise scenario: attack Pearl Harbor. The Langley would launch a dawn strike, attempting to catch the defenders unprepared. Reeves planned to launch 35 aircraft. He wanted them all in the air within 10 minutes. The night before the exercise, he briefed the flight deck crew personally. He walked them through the sequence. He emphasized timing, precision, trust the system, don't improvise, don't hesitate, execute. The morning of April 15th, 1928, 05:45 hours, 35 Boeing F-two-B-one fighters spotted on the Langley's deck. Reeves gave the order from the bridge. Flight quarters. The coloured shirts moved. Yellow shirts positioned themselves at key control points. Blue shirts stood by each aircraft. Brown shirts climbed into cockpits. Purple shirts had already completed fueling the previous afternoon. Everything was pre-positioned, pre-checked, ready. 0600 hours. First engine start. The lead aircraft, positioned forward, fired up its right radial. The sound was sharp crack of combustion, then the steady roar of 9 cylinders turning. The brown shirt in the cockpit held the brakes. The yellow shirt in front watched a stopwatch. Behind the first aircraft, the second aircraft started, then the third, then the fourth. Within 90 seconds, 35 engines were running. The flight deck was a wall of sound, props spinning, exhausts belching blue smoke, the ship vibrating with mechanical energy. 0603 hours. The yellow shirt in front of the lead aircraft gave the signal. Throttle up. The pilot pushed the throttle forward. The brown shirt plane captain jumped out of the cockpit, checked the wheels were clear, and gave a thumbs up. The yellow shirt stepped aside, arm raised, pointing forward. The first Boeing F-two-B-one rolled forward, accelerated down the deck, lifted off, 23 seconds from engine start to wheels up. The instant the first aircraft cleared the deck, the blue shirts swarmed. They pushed the second aircraft forward. The yellow shirt directed it into position. No hesitation. The second aircraft was rolling 30 seconds after the first, then the third, then the fourth. Continuous flow, no gaps. The coloured shirts moved like choreographed dancers, each knowing their part, each executing without thought, muscle memory from hundreds of practice sessions. 06, 12 hours. All 35 aircraft were airborne, 7 minutes total, one aircraft every 12 seconds. The flight deck was suddenly empty except for crew members securing their equipment. On the bridge, Reeves allowed himself a slight smile. He'd just demonstrated something no naval force in the world could match: carrier aviation at tempo that made the carrier a legitimate offensive weapon, not just a scout platform. The 35 F-two-B-one fighters formed up over the Langley and headed for Pearl Harbor. They arrived at 06:55 hours, just as the sun was rising. The Army Air Corps defenders never saw them coming. The exercise umpires ruled that the Langley's aircraft achieved total surprise and would have inflicted devastating damage if this had been real combat. The strike demonstrated that carrier aviation could attack strategic targets with effectiveness that rivaled battleship bombardment and do it from hundreds of miles offshore. When the aircraft returned later that morning, Reeves had the flight deck crew execute another test. Recovery operations. The old procedure took hours. Each aircraft landed, got trapped by the arresting cables, taxied forward, and was lowered by elevator to the main deck before the next aircraft landed. 12 aircraft took 90 minutes minimum. Reeves had redesigned recovery too, the crash barrier concept, a collapsible net positioned across the deck. Aircraft would land, catch the arresting wire, hook would be released, blue shirts would push the aircraft forward, and it would stop against the barrier to protect it from following aircraft. The barrier would be lowered, aircraft would taxi over it and park forward. Next aircraft would land immediately. The first recovery using this method was terrifying to watch. Aircraft trapped, blue shirts ran toward it while it was still rolling, released the hook, pushed it forward against the barrier, all within seconds. The barrier protected the parked aircraft. The flight deck aft was clear for the next landing. It worked. They recovered all 35 aircraft in 43 minutes, including time to refuel and reposition for another launch. The Langley had just demonstrated she could generate 2 full strikes in a morning. That was combat power that forced admirals to recalculate what carriers could do. The Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, received Reeves' after-action report in May 1928. The document was 47 pages of operational data, timing charts, and procedural diagrams. It landed on the desk of Rear Admiral William Pratt, president of the War College, who read it twice before calling a meeting with his staff. "Gentlemen," Pratt said, holding up the report, "Captain Reeves just changed naval warfare, and I don't think he realizes how completely." The staff officers looked skeptical. The Langley was an experiment, a slow, converted collier with a wooden deck. What could she possibly demonstrate about modern naval combat that battleships hadn't already proven? Pratt opened to a page filled with numbers. Reeves launched 35 aircraft in 7 minutes. He recovered them in 43 minutes. That means the Langley can generate a full strike, recover, refuel, rearm, and launch again in under 2 hours. A battleship can fire its main battery once every 30 seconds. Even if every shell hits, you're talking about incremental damage. Reeves can put 35 aircraft over a target simultaneously. That's not incremental. That's overwhelming force. One officer raised his hand. "Sir, those are light fighters. Limited payload. A battleship's 14-inch shell does more damage than anything those planes can carry." Pratt nodded. "True, today. But the aircraft will get bigger. The payloads will increase. The ranges will extend. What won't change is the mathematics of concentrated force that Reeves just demonstrated. He proved that carriers can mass strike power faster than any other platform, and he did it with procedures that cost nothing. Colored shirts, hand signals, choreographed deck movements, no new technology required, just better organization. The implications rippled through the War College's wargaming department. For years, they'd been running fleet problems where carriers played supporting roles, scouts for the battleships, light harassment forces, nothing that could decide a battle. Now, Pratt ordered the game designers to rerun scenarios with carrier strike capabilities based on Reeves's numbers. When they did, the results shocked everyone. In simulated engagements, carrier task forces using Reeves' methods could strike first, strike hard, and withdraw before enemy battleships even located them. The range advantage was overwhelming. A carrier operating 200 miles offshore could attack coastal targets while remaining beyond the reach of any surface vessel. If the strike achieved surprise, if concentration was maintained, carriers could potentially disable enemy battleships before the heavy guns ever fired. The War College published a classified study in August 1928 titled The Potential of Carrier Aviation as Primary Striking Force. The conclusions were cautious but clear. Recent developments in deck operations suggest that aircraft carriers may evolve from reconnaissance platforms to offensive weapons capable of independent action. Further development is warranted. That dry academic language masked a revolution. The battleship admirals who dominated the Navy for 50 years were reading reports that suggested their capital ships might become obsolete. They pushed back hard. Battleships were proven. Carriers were experimental. Reeves's success was interesting but hardly conclusive. Maybe it worked in the Pacific with perfect weather. Maybe it worked because the Langley's pilots were exceptional. Maybe it was luck. Reeves anticipated the resistance. In September of 1928, he invited Admiral William Vesey Pratt, now promoted to Commander-in-Chief Battle Fleet, to observe Langley operations personally. Pratt came aboard with a team of battleship captains, men who'd spent their careers thinking about 16-inch guns and belt armor. Reeves staged a demonstration that was calculated to impress and intimidate. The Langley would launch 2 full strikes against a simulated target, recover, rearm, and launch a third strike, all within 4 hours. The weather that day was deliberately chosen: rough seas, wind gusting to 25 knots. Conditions the battleship admirals expected would expose carrier aviation's limitations. At 0800 hours, Reeves launched 36 aircraft in 8 minutes. The colored shirt system worked flawlessly despite the pitching deck. Yellow shirts adjusted hand signals for wind, blue shirts compensated for the ship's roll, brown shirts kept pilots calm. Every aircraft cleared the deck, successfully. Pratt watched from the bridge, saying nothing, taking notes. The aircraft returned at 0930 hours. Recovery in rough seas should have been dangerous, potentially disastrous. Instead, the Langley's deck crew executed the barrier system with precision that made it look routine. Aircraft trapped, got pushed forward against the crash barrier, taxied to parking spots so tight that ground crew climbed over wings to reach cockpits. All 36 aircraft recovered in 52 minutes, 3 minutes longer than calm weather operations. Acceptable variance. The purple shirts immediately swarmed the spotted aircraft. Fuel lines connected, hoses flowing. Drums of gasoline rolled across the pitching deck by blue shirts who'd practiced in worse conditions. The brown shirts opened engine cowlings, checking oil levels, inspecting cylinders. Yellow shirts directed the choreography, ensuring teams didn't interfere with each other. By 10:30 hours, all aircraft were refueled, inspected, and ready for second launch. At 10:45, Reeves launched again, this time 38 aircraft. He'd added 2 more by tightening the deck park even further. The launch took 9 minutes, still faster than any other carrier in the world could manage in perfect conditions. The aircraft struck their simulated target and returned by 12:15. Recovery took 48 minutes. They'd improved. At 13:30 hours, Reeves launched the third strike. 36 aircraft in 7 minutes and 42 seconds. A new record. The aircraft struck their target and recovered by 1500 hours. 3 full strikes in 7 hours. Pratt watched the entire evolution from the bridge, occasionally asking questions, mostly staying silent. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. When the last aircraft was secured, Pratt asked Reeves to join him in the flag briefing room. The battleship captains were there, reviewing their notes, comparing observations. Pratt looked at Reeves and asked a simple question. "Can other carriers replicate this?" Reeves didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir. Everything we're doing is procedural. The colored shirt system works on any flight deck. The barrier recovery system requires minimal equipment. The deck park concept applies to any carrier with adequate deck space. The only requirement is training. Deck crews need to practice until the movements become automatic. Pilots need to trust the system. Officers need to let go of their assumptions about what's possible." One of the battleship captains spoke up. "Captain Reeves, you've demonstrated impressive efficiency with the Langley, but she's a small ship, slow, limited range. What happens when the Navy builds real carriers, purpose-built ships with larger air groups?" Reeves smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd been waiting for exactly that question. "Sir, the Langley is the worst carrier we'll ever operate. She's slow, she's cramped, her elevator is inadequate, her flight deck is barely long enough. If we can launch 38 aircraft in under 8 minutes from the Langley, imagine what we'll do with Lexington or Saratoga when they commission. Those ships have flight decks over 800 feet long. They'll carry 72 aircraft. With proper procedures, those carriers could launch their entire air group in under 12 minutes. That's combat power that changes the tactical balance." Pratt nodded slowly. "And you believe the procedures you've developed will scale to larger operations?" "I don't believe it, sir. I know it. The mathematics are clear. The colored shirt system becomes more important with larger deck crews, not less. The choreography we've developed prevents chaos. The more aircraft you operate, the more you need the system to maintain control. Lexington and Saratoga won't need to develop new procedures. They'll adopt ours and refine them for larger decks." The meeting ended with Pratt issuing an order that validated everything Reeves had accomplished. Effective immediately, all naval aviation units will adopt Captain Reeves's deck procedures, colored shirt protocols, barrier recovery systems, deck park operations. This becomes fleet doctrine. We'll document it, we'll standardize it, and we'll train every carrier deck crew to these standards. 3 months later, in December 1928, the USS Lexington commissioned. She was everything the Langley wasn't. Fast, 33 knots, massive flight deck, 888 feet long. Designed from the keel up as a carrier, she could operate 72 aircraft, 6 times the Langley's original capacity. Her first commanding officer was Captain Ernest King, a battleship officer being converted to aviation command through the same observer course Reeves had taken. King was brilliant, ambitious, and deeply skeptical of the sight. Colored shirt system. He thought it was gimmicky, unnecessary for professional sailors who should know their jobs without needing costumes. King's first month commanding Lexington was chaos. The deck crew wore standard uniforms. Operations were conducted using verbal orders shouted over engine noise. Aircraft launches took over an hour for a full deck load. King watched his beautiful new carrier struggle to match the performance of the old covered wagon, and couldn't understand why. In January 1929, Reeves was promoted to Rear Admiral and given command of aircraft squadrons, battle fleet. His first official act was to visit Lexington and observe operations. What he saw confirmed his fears. King was trying to run carrier operations like a battleship. Rigid hierarchy, formal communication, no visual coordination system. The result was inefficiency that wasted the Lexington's potential. Reeves requested a private meeting with King in the captain's cabin. The conversation was blunt. "Ernest, you're fighting the system instead of using it." King bristled. "Admiral, the Lexington has a trained crew. Professional sailors. They don't need colored shirts to know their jobs." Reeves pulled out a stopwatch. Let's test that. Launch a full deck load. Time it. Then adopt the coloured shirt system for 1 week. Launch again. Compare the times. If I'm wrong, I'll personally write a memo rescinding the coloured shirt directive for the Lexington. King couldn't refuse the challenge without looking incompetent. The next morning, Lexington launched 60 aircraft using King's verbal command system. It took 83 minutes. Aircraft queued behind each other. Crew members ran back and forth, asking for clarification. Yellow shirts, who weren't wearing yellow because King had abolished the coloured jerseys, couldn't coordinate movements across the massive deck. The launch worked, but it was slow and chaotic. 1 week later, after Reeves had personally supervised, retraining the Lexington's deck crew in coloured shirt protocols, King launched 60 aircraft again, this time 17 minutes. The difference was staggering. King watched from the bridge as the coloured system transformed his flight deck into synchronized precision. Yellow shirts directing traffic with hand signals visible across the entire deck, blue shirts moving aircraft in coordinated pushes, purple shirts managing fuel lines without verbal orders because everyone could see they were fueling crew, brown shirts doing final checks while already positioned at their aircraft. When the last plane launched, King walked down to the flight deck. He found the chief yellow shirt, a tough old boatswain's mate named Samuel Morrison who'd transferred from the Langley. King extended his hand. "Chief, I owe you an apology, and I owe Admiral Reeves a memo admitting I was wrong." Morrison shook his hand. "Sir, the Admiral doesn't need a memo. He needs you to teach other captains what you just learned. The system works if you trust it." King did more than admit he was wrong. He became the coloured shirt system's most vocal advocate. When the USS Saratoga commissioned in November 1927, King personally supervised her deck crew training. When the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics published Manual for Flight Deck Operations in 1930, King wrote the foreword. The manual codified everything Reeves had developed: coloured jerseys, standard hand signals, barrier recovery, deck park procedures. It became required reading for every naval aviator and deck crew member. The system spread beyond American carriers. In 1931, a Japanese naval observer mission visited the Lexington. They watched flight operations. They took photographs. They interviewed deck crew. 6 months later, the Imperial Japanese Navy adopted a modified coloured shirt system for their carriers Akagi and Kaga. The modifications were minor, different colour choices to fit Japanese cultural preferences, but the underlying principles were identical: visual coordination, specialised teams, choreographed movement. The British Royal Navy resisted longer. They maintained their doctrine of storing aircraft below and operating small deck loads. But in 1936, after observing joint exercises with American carriers, the Admiralty quietly authorized trials of deck park operations aboard HMS Glorious. The trials proved what Reeves had demonstrated 8 years earlier. Deck park doubled operational capacity. Within 2 years, British carriers adopted modified versions of American procedures, though they stubbornly refused to adopt coloured shirts until World War II forced them to admit visual coordination worked better than shouted orders. By 1939, when war erupted in Europe, every major carrier in the world operated using principles developed on the Langley between 1925 and 1928. The coloured shirt system, deck, park, barrier recovery, rapid launch sequences. These weren't American innovations anymore. They were universal carrier doctrine, the foundation that made naval aviation possible as an independent striking force. Reeves himself continued rising through Navy ranks. He became Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet in 1933, the Navy's highest operational command. He retired as a full admiral in 1936, having transformed not just carrier operations, but the Navy's entire strategic thinking about aviation. His legacy wasn't measured in battles fought, he never commanded in combat, but in the framework he created that allowed carrier aviation to become decisive during World War II. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The Japanese carrier strike force that attacked was commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, operating from 6 carriers. Those carriers launched 183 aircraft in the first wave, followed by 170 in the second wave. Total launch time for the first wave, approximately 15 minutes. The Japanese had refined Reeves's methods into devastating effectiveness. The attack succeeded because carrier aviation had evolved into exactly what Reeves predicted 13 years earlier, a striking force capable of projecting overwhelming power at ranges where enemy defenses couldn't reach them. The colored shirt deck crews, the choreographed launch sequences, the deck park operations that allowed 6 carriers to operate over 350 aircraft, all of it traced directly to the Langley in 1928. American carriers responded using the same doctrine. The USS Enterprise, returning to Pearl Harbor during the attack, immediately began preparations for a counterstrike using procedures that would have looked familiar to any Langley veteran from the 20s. Yellow shirts directing aircraft, blue shirts positioning them, purple shirts fueling them, brown shirts running final checks. The Enterprise didn't launch that day. She was too far at sea when the attack occurred. But when American carriers did strike back in the months that followed, they did so using the system Reeves built. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 demonstrated carrier aviation's decisive potential. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, launched coordinated strikes against 4 Japanese carriers. The American deck crews launched over 200 aircraft in multiple waves, achieved tactical surprise through timing and coordination, and destroyed all 4 Japanese carriers in a single day. The victory turned the Pacific War in America's favor. The launch sequences at Midway were executed by men wearing colored shirts. Yellow, blue, purple, brown. They used hand signals developed in the late 1920s. They practiced choreography refined through thousands of peacetime launches. When chaos erupted, when bombs fell and fires burned, when carriers maneuvered desperately to avoid attacks, the colored shirt system kept operations functioning because everyone knew their role by sight. Nobody needed to ask questions. Nobody needed verbal orders. You saw a yellow shirt pointing. You followed the direction. You saw a blue shirt pushing. You helped. The system worked under the worst possible conditions because it was designed for exactly that. Through the entire Pacific War, American carriers maintained operational tempos that Japanese carriers couldn't match, despite similar technology and often superior aircraft. The difference wasn't equipment, it was procedures. American carriers could launch and recover faster, sustain higher sortie rates, and maintain those rates for longer periods because their deck operations were ruthlessly efficient. Efficient because Reeves had questioned every assumption back when questioning assumptions about carriers could get you labeled a crank. Essex-class carriers, the backbone of America's Pacific fleet, routinely operated air groups of 90 aircraft. They could launch their entire deck load in under 20 minutes. They could recover, refuel, rearm, and launch again within 2 hours. Some Essex-class carriers generated over 200 sorties in a single day during intense operations. That sortie rate was only possible because colored shirt crews could coordinate movements across flight decks crammed with aircraft, ordnance, and fuel lines without verbal communication. The fast carrier task forces that destroyed Japanese naval aviation in 1944 operated multiple carriers in formation, coordinating launches and strikes across dozens of ships. The complexity was staggering. Yet it worked because every carrier used identical procedures. A yellow shirt on the Enterprise used the same hand signals as a yellow shirt on the Lexington. A pilot transferring ships knew what every colored jersey meant without asking. Standardization enabled coordination that would have been impossible if each carrier operated independently. By 1945, American carriers were launching and recovering aircraft under conditions that would have seemed impossible in the 20s. Night operations, kamikaze attacks, typhoons. The colored shirt system functioned because it reduced cognitive load. Deck crew didn't have to think about coordination. They saw colors. They knew roles. They executed. That automatic response was the difference between success and chaos when your carrier was under attack and every second mattered. Joseph Reeves retired as a full admiral in 1936, but his influence extended through the entire war. Every carrier captain who commanded in combat had learned flight operations from manuals Reeves wrote or procedures he developed. Every deck crew chief had practiced hand signals codified from Langley operations. Every carrier doctrine officer referenced Reeves' after-action reports from the 20s when planning modern strikes. He never fired a shot in combat, never commanded a carrier in battle, yet his fingerprints were on every carrier victory from Midway to later Gulf to Okinawa. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the largest carrier battle in history, involved 15 American carriers launching over 400 aircraft in coordinated strikes against Japanese forces. The launch coordination required was unprecedented. Multiple carriers timing their launches so aircraft would arrive over the target simultaneously from different directions. The only way to manage that complexity was through standardized procedures that every ship executed identically. Colored shirts, hand signals, choreographed deck movements. The system Reeves built 20 years earlier made the victory possible. Post-war analysis of carrier operations revealed statistics that validated Reeves's original insights. American carriers averaged 1,2 sorties per aircraft per day during intense operations. Japanese carriers averaged 0.7 sorties per aircraft per day, despite having comparable technology. That difference, 70% higher sortie generation, was purely procedural. American carriers could turn aircraft around faster because their deck operations were more efficient because they'd spent 20 years refining procedures while other navies focused on building bigger ships with heavier armor. The jet age transformed carrier aviation in the late 1940s and 50s. New aircraft, new catapults, new arresting gear. But the colored shirt system persisted because it solved a problem that technology couldn't fix. Human coordination. Jets were faster, but deck crew still needed to move them without collision. Catapults were more powerful, but someone still needed to direct aircraft into position. The fundamentals Reeves identified, visual coordination, specialized teams, choreographed movement, remained relevant regardless of technology changes. Modern supercarriers like the USS Gerald R. Ford operate aircraft that Reeves couldn't have imagined. F-35C stealth fighters, E-2D Hawkeye radar planes, Super Hornet strike aircraft. Yet the deck crew still wears colored shirts. Yellow for aircraft directors, blue for handlers, purple for fuel, green for catapults and arresting gear, brown for plane captains, red for ordnance, white for safety. The system has expanded, adding colors for new specializations, but the core principle remains identical to what Reeves implemented in 1926. Make roles visible, eliminate verbal communication. Coordinate through sight. A modern carrier can launch an aircraft every 20 to 30 seconds using steam catapults, much faster than the Langley's 12-second interval using aircraft that took off on their own power. But the deck choreography enabling those launches is directly descended from Reeves's methods. The yellow shirt, who directs an F-35 into catapult position, uses hand signals, developed in the 1920s. The blue shirts, who position the aircraft, practice movements refined through a century of operations. The system scales from the Langley's 534-foot deck to the Ford's 1,092-foot deck because it's based on human coordination principles that don't change with technology. Joseph Mason Reeves died in March 1948 at age 70. His New York Times obituary mentioned his football career at the Naval Academy, his service as Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet, and his role in developing carrier aviation. What it didn't mention was the colored shirts, the hand signals, the deck park innovations, the 1,000 questions he'd asked in 1925 that nobody else thought to ask. Those details were buried in naval technical manuals and operational histories that civilians never read. But every sailor who ever served on a carrier flight deck knew the name Bull Reeves, even if they didn't know why. They called him that or what he'd done. They knew because their chiefs told them during training. They knew because the colored shirt they wore existed because some admiral back in the 20s decided to question why everyone wore the same uniform. They knew because carrier aviation's basic vocabulary, spotted deck, barrier crash, cyclic operations, all originated from one man's refusal to accept that 12 aircraft was the maximum a carrier could handle. The USS Langley, the ship where it all began, survived until February 1942. She'd been converted to a seaplane tender by then, no longer operating fixed-wing aircraft. Japanese aircraft attacked her off Java. She took bomb hits, started sinking. Her crew abandoned ship and she was scuttled by American destroyers to prevent capture. But photographs from her final days show deck crew wearing coloured shirts, even though she wasn't operating carriers anymore. Old habits, old procedures. They persisted because they worked. Today, if you visit the flight deck of any carrier in any navy that operates fixed-wing aircraft from ships, you'll see coloured jerseys. The specific colours vary by nation. The exact procedures differ slightly. But the underlying principle, visual coordination through standardized colours and hand signals, is universal. The French Navy uses coloured jerseys on Charles de Gaulle. The Royal Navy adopted them for their Queen Elizabeth-class carriers. India's INS Vikramaditya operates with coloured shirt protocols. China's Liaoning and Shandong carriers use coloured jerseys that look suspiciously similar to American patterns, probably because Chinese naval observers studied American procedures the same way Japanese observers did in the 1930s. The system spread because it solved a fundamental problem that every carrier faces regardless of size, technology, or nation. How do you coordinate dozens of people and millions of pounds of aircraft and ordnance on a small, moving, dangerous platform where verbal communication is impossible due to noise, where mistakes kill people, and where speed determines combat effectiveness? You make everything visual. You standardize roles. You choreograph movement. You practice until it becomes automatic. That's what Reeves figured out in 1925, and nobody's found a better solution in the century since. The legacy extends beyond the coloured shirts themselves. Reeves's methodology, question assumptions, test everything, let data drive decisions, became foundational to how the Navy approaches operational problems. When something doesn't work, don't defend it because that's how we've always done it. Figure out why it's failing and fix it. That seems obvious now. In the 1920s, when tradition and seniority often outweighed evidence and innovation, it was revolutionary. Modern carrier doctrine traces every major procedural innovation back to Langley operations between 1925 and 1929. Cyclic operations, launching and recovering aircraft in timed intervals to maximize sortie rates. Deck park, storing aircraft topside to reduce elevator dependence, alpha strikes, launching the entire air group simultaneously for overwhelming force. Cross-deck operations, coordinating launches and recoveries across multiple carriers. All of it originated from experiments Reeves conducted when the entire world was trying to figure out what carriers were actually supposed to do. The coloured shirt system is visible, obvious. Anyone visiting a carrier sees it immediately. But the deeper legacy, the cultural transformation, where questioning assumptions became acceptable, where frontline observations influenced doctrine, where efficiency mattered more than tradition, that legacy is invisible, but more important. The Navy that existed in 1925 would have court-martialed an officer for bypassing regulations the way Reeves did. The Navy he left behind in 1936 celebrated innovation and rewarded officers who challenged conventional wisdom with evidence. Every carrier pilot who launches from a catapult, every deck crew member who marshals aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness, every air boss who coordinates the organized chaos of flight operations, all of them operate within a system descended from the Langley's experiments. Most don't know the history, they just know the procedures work. They know because they've practiced them thousands of times. They know because their trainers learned from trainers who learned from trainers in an unbroken chain extending back to 1926, when a battleship captain who'd never flown an airplane looked at a carrier deck and asked, "What if we did this completely differently?" The answer to that question changed naval warfare more thoroughly than any technological innovation of the interwar period. Not battleship guns or submarine torpedoes or fire control systems. Coloured shirts. Hand signals. Choreographed deck movements. Simple ideas executed with precision. That was the revolution. That was how 35 aircraft launched in 7 minutes. That was how carrier aviation went from curiosity to dominant naval force within 2 decades. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.